So here we are at the final stage of our Harley Quinn dress tutorial. We're now going to make the bands that go around the arm. The way I'm making mine is so that they resemble hair bubbles. So what I do is take a scrap piece of my polyester. I actually sewed 2 bits together that I had as I was running out of material. I take 4 tulle layers more than double the width of the polyester and fold them in half. I leave it so I have the polyester on one side and the tulle underneath. And I hold these together with sewing clips. I just do a basic straight stitch to hold these together. I'll be putting in a more permanent stitch afterwards. As this is a temporary stitch, we do not need to backstitch. Again, I'm using magazine paper for underneath to stop it sliding. Next, we're going to sew elastic onto the armband. To get the length of the elastic, I just wrapped it around my arm and sort of held it taut until I liked the length of it and where it was going to sit. I then pinned this to the armband. As you can see, I've got the pins running across the way. This helps to keep the elastic and the fabric taut together and they won't move about. To sew the elastic to the fabric, I stretch the elastic right out until they both sit flat. To sew this can be a bit tricky, so you might have to do some practice runs. I sew with a zigzag stitch because the fabric needs to stretch. I also backstitch because this is a permanent stitch and we don't want it to come out. What I do when sewing this is with my right hand I pull it taut and I use my left hand to control the fabric. You can also hold it at the back if that's easier. Once I get to each pin, I take them out and continue stitching. You might notice I've only made one armband. When I looked at reference photos, it looked like she had the armband on the left arm, but on the right arm, like it looked see-through. So I thought maybe at one point it's implied that it's come off her arm or something like that because she's been fighting and that's her dominant arm. So I wanted my design to stay that kind of isometric way, so I decided to do one of these armbands and then I'll do 2 of the actual bows and I'll show you how I do that. Continue down the length of the fabric and backstitch. When you're finished, it should look like this. At this point you want to cut off any excess tulle. You don't want it bunching up when you turn this inside out. So we're back at my favourite part of the tutorial, which is to turn this inside out. This was actually a lot easier to turn inside out than the straps were. That's because there's a lot more width to this part. Make sure you find the middle of all the tulle layers and then turn it inside out. Obviously, if you have a turning tool, it would make it easier to do this. So once it's turned inside out, it looks like this, and all I need to do is sew this elastic together and finish the ends. To sew the elastic together, turn them inside on themselves. Then use a zigzag stitch again so that it can stretch. To finish off the edges of the armband, you can use the slip stitch as before. That way we get nice hidden stitches. So the first thing I noticed about the bows is that they are that kind of crimped fabric, so I did try to do the bow and then crimp afterwards, however it didn't look very good, so I've decided to crimp the fabric first and then do the bow. So I take a long length of tulle and then I use the crimpers to crimp the fabric. You'll notice the length of tulle I've chosen is a scrap. It's a bit raggedy along the edges, but I feel it fits the look we're going for. The one thing I learned when crimping the fabric was to not crimp the actual folds at the edge. If you do that, you'll end up with a crease along the edges. I folded the fabric this way so I could try and get into all the parts, but I had to kind of fold it over a few different times to get all the crimps in there. So once you've crimped the fabric, this is what it would look like. It won't be exactly perfect, but I think that's fine because it suits that look. Next, we're going to tie this into a standard bow. If you tie it the first time like me and you don't like the way the ends are sitting, like one was longer than the other, just take it out and do it again. So that's looking a lot better, and then I just play about with it until I like the look of the bow. And then how to finish the bow is if you grab the actual top of the bow and you can pull it out from each edge, it just looks a lot nicer and it kind of matches the look that it is in the film. Now we can attach the armband to the arm strap. To do this, I wear the dress and put the armband on. I slip the strap through the armband. I then move my arm in every direction until the arm strap moves to where it should be sewn. So once I've found the comfortable point for the arm strap, I take the armband off whilst holding it and the strap together. This keeps a note of where it needs to be sewn. Then I use a ball-headed pin to pin them together. Once I have the pin marking where these parts should be joined, I actually put the arm strap on the outside of the armband and then I sew them together with a slip stitch in a rectangular shape. This means we have hidden stitches again and it is secure. In order to attach the tulle bow to the armband, I use a ball-headed pin to mark where it should be. The bow basically should face the front, or thereabouts. I decided to make the bow detachable, so I'm using snaps. My reasoning behind this is that the tulle is such a delicate fabric, and I feel at some point I may need to replace them. To attach the snaps, we're going to hand stitch. To start sewing, I make a knot in the end of the thread and pull it through from the back. This is the most inconspicuous place to start the thread. So I pull it all the way through roughly where my pin is. The snap has 4 little holes round the side, so I put the thread through one of the holes, making sure obviously that it's the correct way round. So I'm quite happy with that placement. What I do is I take the needle and go just outside the snap, put it through the fabric around it and back up. Notice it goes back through the hole and out. We're essentially creating little loops of thread that goes through the hole and through the fabric. For the first hole, I do about 4 loops of thread to keep it secure. If you try and sew quite close to the edge of the snap, it will look a lot neater. So once I've done 4 or 5 loops, I take the needle and I put it through the fabric so it comes out near the edge of the next hole. That means the thread's hidden between the holes, if you know what I mean. For the second hole, I do the same process where I put the needle through the hole and out through the fabric and I loop it round about 4 or 5 times. Once I've done the second hole, I then move on to the third hole and then the fourth hole. To secure the thread, I sew straight through the back and do a couple of back stitches. When the snap is complete, this is what it looks like. Just to note, it's the exact same process for the other side of the snap that's on the bow. For the snap on my bow, I put it just in the middle of the knot of the bow. This was the most secure place to put it. If you clip them together, this is what they would look like. So another thing I had noticed on the armband was there's a bit of tulle that goes around her arm, but it looked to me like it was underneath the armband, so I decided to go with that design decision. To get the correct length for this tulle band, I wrap it around one of my arms and tie it in a knot. So I decided to go with exactly the same process for this band. I've sewed a snap onto the knotted part of it in exactly the same way as I've just shown you, and then I actually added the other side of the snap on the underside of the armband. This means that the knot would be just behind where the bow is on the other side. Obviously I couldn't sew it directly behind the other snap, so I misaligned it just a little. So once all my tulle attachments were done, this is what it looked like. Obviously this is on the wrong arm, but it was the easiest thing to show you. And you can see this is the part we've just done. This is the tulle that goes around the arm with the knot. It might not be exact to the film, but I like the look of it and that's what counts. So you can see here, this is the part that comes off underneath, that goes around the arm. And we can also take off the bow from the front. So for the right arm, I feel like this idea was a little flimsier. I did the bow in exactly the same way, but I didn't add snaps. I took the other piece of material that would be used to go round the arm, and I actually put it through the knot on the bow. To get the sizing, I then put this around my arm and tie it in a knot. And obviously I don't want that knot sitting there behind my arm, so I move it around just behind the bow so it's less conspicuous. Now I was going to sew this to the dress, but I decided to keep it separate, so every time I wear this dress I actually just slip this part of the arm on. I put the armband through it. I didn't really want to attach the tulle because it's so delicate, and having tried wearing it this way it's totally fine. So in previous tutorials I did mention that I add a row 9 to my dress. Once I saw it, I felt like it just needed that tiny bit extra bit of length. I had a couple of centimetres of fabric left underneath the dress that I could sew tulle layers to. So what I did was I made this tulle extra long. so it stuck out from the bottom of row 8 and looked uniform to all the other rows. I then just obviously shaped it, etc. It ended up just being a tiny little bit at the bottom, but I feel like it was totally worth it. So you may want to consider this when you're designing your dress. One thing I want to add is I actually changed the fit of the tulle on the top. When I tried it all on, I felt it looked a bit baggy. I'm not entirely sure why this occurred, as I did actually tack everything down. But all I did to fix this was I took out the stitching, pulled the tulle down, pinned it all together again and sewed it back up. If, like me, you want your dress to look more cinematic, then I would recommend weathering the dress. So I've started weathering the dress already, and what I'll do is I can show you this side has not been weathered at all, and this side has been weathered, and you can see the difference between the two. I personally definitely prefer the weathered look. I also think with weathering sometimes it just adds another dimension and really brings up the look. If you'd rather skip this step, that's totally up to you. I just really love getting that cinematic look and just looking like you've walked off a set. I use a very simple process to weather this dress. I take some black acrylic paint, I mix it with water and I apply. I apply the watery black paint with a paintbrush. I then take a bit of tissue paper and rub it on the skirt. This picks up a lot of the paint but leaves a residue. It also blends it out. The more black paint that is mixed with water will give a much dirtier look. The less black paint to water ratio, then you'll get a much more subtle look. The weathered look I'm trying to achieve is when Harley Quinn escapes from the Corto Maltese palace. If you think about that scene, she's been chained up for quite a while. We don't actually know what happened right before that scene. She could have been dragged along the ground or anything like that. When she escapes, she also does a lot of fighting. So we know that this dress is not going to be pristine. I decided to do some really simple weathering. If you imagine wearing a dress like this and it got dirty, the place it seems to cling to first is the ends. So when I'm weathering this dress, I'm going to focus on the very ends of each row. And then I can sort of blend it upwards. I want the weathering to be quite minimal because she doesn't come out filthy looking, but there's no way that this dress would be perfect after going through all that. I do this process for the whole skirt. I'm sure to leave out some areas of the rows when doing this. I don't want it to look too costumey. And I think realistically there would be some bits that weren't so dirty. And some that are. So I do a similar process for the top. I think the seam would be quite dirty, so I start there. I don't want this to be too dirty, so I am using quite watery black paint. And you can see when it goes on at first it's very minimal, and I build it up. If you're ever unsure, then just start subtly and do the same as what I'm doing here. Hopefully you can start to see that it does sort of build up over time and starts to look a bit dirtier. I also weather a lot of the ruching. And what I do is I sort of run it along any of the edges of the ruching. This weathers them but also helps them stand out a bit more. So there we have it, we've completed the dress. I'll also have tutorials for the wig, for the makeup, for the javelin and for the underskirt. See you later and hope you enjoy cosplaying as Harley.